Hi, everybody. I'm going to go through a full 5 document DBQ with you all. I chose this document, and you can see it here, and I'll post it alongside the video on Canvas so you can see the documents as I go. But I chose this DBQ because it applies both to AP World and AP Euro. This was the DBQ for World History 2 years ago, so it might sound familiar to some of you who took World 2 years ago. Uh, so the question here is evaluate the extent to which railroads affected the process of empire building in Afro Eurasia between 1860 and 1918. So for Euro, this applies to time period 3. For World, this applies to time period 5. So this is really the last stuff we were doing right before we went on spring break and started review. So I think I'm going to divide this up into 2 videos. The first video, I'm going to go through the documents and source them and prep them. In a second video, I'm going to kind of organize them into an outline. I'm not going to write the whole thing, but I am going to put it all into an outline so that you could then go ahead and write an essay based on what I wrote. You're not going to write an essay based on this particular DBQ. This is really just to serve as an example of what to do. So before we look at the documents, I thought it would be a good idea to do the context because you can do the context without actually looking at any of the documents. So let's think about the context here. So when we write about the context, we want to think about the big picture things that are going on around the same time. So what's going on in the world around the year 1860 up to the start of the 20th century? Well, some things that immediately come to mind is that we see an increase in nationalism and conflict. Those of you in Euro might recognize that this is the time of German and Italian unification. This is also the time right after the Crimean War. So there's a lot of conflict and nationalism happening in Europe. We also know that during this period, the United States is starting the Spanish-American War. So there's a lot of nationalism and a lot of conflict. We also know, and maybe the more low-hanging fruit here, is that this is also a period of increased industrialization. And it roughly corresponds at the start of the second industrial revolution. And remember, the second industrial revolution required new exotic raw materials. Things like oil or rubber that you just can't find in Europe. You have to go to places like Africa or Southeast Asia to find these things. So this is the context. When we're thinking about why empire building became such a big thing in this time frame from 1860 to 1918, these are 2 things that we might want to keep in mind for our context. Now, neither one of these really has anything to do with empire building, and that's kind of the point. We want to think about what's driving countries to start building empires. And it's this stuff. All right, so let's dive into the first document. Remember, you can do the context without looking at any of the documents, and I really think you should, because it'll start getting you to brainstorm and you won't really be influenced by what any of the documents say in writing the context. All right, so let's move on to document 1. So if you want to pause it and read the document, of course, I'm going to post this alongside the video, so you don't need to worry about doing that if you don't want to. But here's the gist of what document 1 says. Document 1 is a petition from high caste Indians that feel mistreated by the British when they ride on trains. So that's kind of the main idea of document 1. You could also say that they feel like they deserve, how about we say they deserve better treatment because they are high caste. They're used to being treated better. They're used to feeling better. And the British don't treat them that way. The British treat the high caste Indians like they treat the low caste Indians. So remember, when we go through the documents, and this is what you should be doing in about 10 minutes, we want the main idea and we want the answer to one of those sourcing questions. In this case, I think it's probably the audience that we should think about. The audience, and it tells us right there in the source line, the audience here is the British colonial government. And why do they want to address this to the British colonial government? They want better treatment. They want to be treated better. And we can tell that these are high caste Indians, and they know who they are writing to because they mention here the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage was the awful transatlantic voyage for African slaves. And the reason they bring up the Middle Passage is because the British led the anti-slavery movement. And I think what these Indians are trying to do is connect their mistreatment to the mistreatment of African slaves. Obviously, they are not the same thing, but the Indians feel like maybe they can tug at the heartstrings of the British and maybe get them to do something about this. So remember that the question is asking us about how railroads affected the process of empire building. So I want us to try to think about, as we go through this, different types of effects. And so for this first one, I think that there is a social or a cultural effect. Right? We want to make the Indians more British. Remember, when we talked about imperialism in the past, one of the big motivations was to quote unquote civilize people who weren't European. And so the Indians are acting very British. And so in that sense, it's kind of working. We want to make the Indians more British. What is more British than writing a strongly worded letter? They're even referring back to British history. There's another bit of evidence here in this passage because it also says that the British are eliminating old modes of transit. Kind of forcing them to use the railroad. So when we think about the effects of the railroad, here are some of the effects that we're trying to make the Indians more British. And in this first case, it kind of seems like it's working. Now, I understand that was a lot to do in roughly about 2 minutes. And I'm not expecting you to do all of that, but if you can do some of that in about 2 minutes, remember you should take about 10 minutes to do to do the entire prepping. So that comes to about 2 minutes per document. So I know that I took longer than 2 minutes to do that, but I kind of wanted to show you my thought process and all of the things you might do in there. So you don't have to do all of that, but you should do some of that in about 2 minutes. All right, moving on to document 2. So document 2 is a completely different kind of source. So document 2 is written by the Ottomans. And so the basic main idea of this document is that the Ottomans want to build a railroad for Muslims to go to Mecca. So they don't have to use foreign transport. Now, that's the main idea. So we also want to answer one of the sourcing questions. Again, I think the audience or the purpose is probably the best way to go here. The audience and the purpose here kind of go together. So the audience here is the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan. And we want to address the Sultan for a couple of reasons. To promote him internationally as the leader of all Muslims, because he is still the caliph. And another thing that we want to do is squeeze out the foreign powers as influential. We don't want We don't want the foreign powers to really be influencing Muslims. We want the Ottoman Sultan to be influencing Muslims. So we don't want the British or the French to be involved in this. We want the Ottoman Sultan to be involved in this. So again, we want to think about effects, and I think there are two different types of effects here. There is this social cultural effect. And the social cultural effect is that we want to unite the Muslims. That's what we want to do. We want to unite the Muslims. We want to promote an Islamic engineering project to counter the Europeans. Right? And those of you in world history, this makes a lot of sense because there's a long history of Islamic scientific leadership. For a long time, the Muslims were the leaders of science and technology, and this might try to call back to that a little bit. The other type of effect here is a political effect, in that the Ottoman Empire, needs to catch up to the Europeans. And so remember that the Crimean War was a big wake-up call to the Russians, that the Russians needed to start industrializing. The Crimean War also said to the Ottomans, you guys need to catch up. And this is a good example of the Ottomans realizing that they need to catch up. So there is both a social cultural effect here and a political effect here. And now we've kind of got two different types of effects that we can write body paragraphs about. We've got social cultural stuff and we've got political stuff. And as we read the rest of the documents, those are the things we need to keep an eye out for, because I think that's how we need to structure this essay. All right, moving on to document 3. Document 3 is a big map, and I'm actually going to make the screen a little bit bigger over here so you can see the whole thing. So document 3 is a map. It is called the Cape to Cairo Railway. So this is a proposed railway line. It's hard to say. That goes from Cape Town in South Africa all the way up to Cairo in Egypt. This is a line that the British are proposing to build. Those of you in Euro remember that there was a conflict here, or almost a conflict, right in here between the French and the British, as the French attempted to build this north-south railway, and the French were trying to build an east-west railway, and they almost came to a conflict right here in Fashoda. So that's kind of what we see here. So document 3, the main idea of document 3 is actually very simple, because we're just describing what we see. So document 3 is a proposed map of a railroad. I'm going to say railroad instead of railway because railway is hard to say. Spanning the entire length of Africa. And it is a British railroad. The audience here, I think, is interesting. And there's also another interesting purpose here for this. The audience is not who you might expect. The audience here are people from New Zealand. Pretty far away from Africa. So this is in a New Zealand newspaper. So these are New Zealand newspaper readers. That's weird. But when we think about the purpose, the audience starts to kind of make sense, because the purpose here is to promote British colonial superiority or greatness. So just like the colonists in Africa are British subjects, so are the people in New Zealand. So the purpose here is to unite all British subjects. Basically saying, we're great. Now, so these are the purpose. So we've got an audience, we've got a purpose here for this. The when might be useful for the Euro side of this, because this is in 1899 and it is right before that Fashoda crisis, which I think happened in 1901. So if you remember this in Euro, then that might also be useful to show the French that, we mean business, this is our intent, don't mess with us. Now, if we're thinking about effects, so we've got kind of our two groups of effects. You've got a cultural effect, cultural or a social effect, and that is to unite all the British colonial subjects. That's the effect. That's what we're trying to do here. Remember that doing this also helps to prevent domestic problems, which also kind of leads into our political effect. There's a political effect for this too. And the political effect here is not only to help prevent domestic problems by taking their minds off of those domestic problems, but also to deny strength to your rivals. In this case, for the British, that might mean the French or the Germans. And you can even see that they're kind of mentioning the Germans here by name. Okay, so moving on to the next document, document 4. Document 4 is another British source. And so what document 4 says, document 4 basically says that the British feel like the Russians are gaining an advantage by building the Trans-Siberian Railroad to the Far East. So they're really talking about China here. The British feel like they are falling behind the Russians because the Russians are building this railroad out to China, and that's going to get the Russians out there a lot faster than the British can get there. So again, let's think about the audience. Who is this written for? Why is this written for them? So the audience and the purpose here. Again, like some of these other documents we've looked at, we want to promote British nationalism. And we want to get ready to defend British interests in China. And if you note when this is written, this was written in 1901, which was right during the Boxer Rebellion. So we know that the Chinese are not in favor of British imperialism in China. We know that the Boxer Rebellion is either just it's happening now, or it just finished. And we need to defend our British interests there. So for this one, you might bring in the cultural effect again of promoting British nationalism, but I think the biggest effect here is a political one. And the political effect here is that railroads are necessary for defending faraway economic interests. Okay, so let's move on to the last document. This is document 5. I'm going to flip the paper over to make sure I've got enough room. So if you need to pause real quick and finish writing, I'm going to flip the paper over in 3, 2, 1, flipping the paper. All right, so document 5. Document 5 is from another imperial power. So we've heard from the British, we've heard from the Ottomans, and now we're going to hear from the French. So this document basically says that railroads are essential for exporting quote unquote civilization to Africa. And we need to do this to eliminate, I'm going to use the guy's own words here, poverty and barbarism. And for the French, barbarism is basically anything that's not French, or at least anything that's not European. So again, I think the best sourcing question here would be the purpose or the audience. The audience here is French colonial officials. He's not talking to Africans. He's talking to fellow Frenchmen. And so the idea here is that this is kind of like a pep rally. He wants to increase support for the French activity here among French officials. And he's doing this like he's got a good impulse. He wants to make the Africans' lives better. Now, he wants to do it by making them French, which isn't necessarily the right thing to do, but at least I guess his heart is in the right place. So he wants to help them. So what is this French activity? Make Africans more French. And to do that, we need to build railroads. So what's our effect here? Well, again, we see this cultural or social effect. In that railroads better the lives of Africans, and it's the French duty to do this. The guy actually says that in here. Okay, so we've done all the documents, we've got all the effects, we've kind of got a couple of categories. We've got this social/cultural effect that we want to export European culture to better these people's lives. And we've got a political effect that kind of roughly turns into defending economic interests or denying those things to our rivals. So in the interest of time, let's think about a thesis that we might write. And this will be the last part of this video. In the next video, I will kind of put all the pieces together into an outline. So I'm not going to write the whole thing, but I will outline the whole thing. All right, so here's a thesis. Railroads affect empire building greatly through, and here we want to name what the two categories are. I'm going to call the first one cultural manipulation, like turning these people into Europeans. And remember, when we name a category, we want to throw a couple of likes in there. So like imposing European, let's say, cultural norms on non-European people or on non-European societies. And through, we'll call it political strategic thinking. Like, and remember we want to put these likes into our thesis, like building railroads to squeeze out our rivals' influence, penetrate further into new conquests, and prepare for war. So I know that's a pretty complex thesis. You might not need to go into as much detail as I did, but that's a really good example of a thesis, if I don't mind saying so. So I'm going to stop this video. So we've kind of done all of the sourcing and prepping. Now we just got to put all of the puzzle pieces we've made into an outline. And so the next video I post will be about outlining this essay. So this is the end of part 1. If you like what you've seen, smash that subscribe button, and I will see you in just a second with video 2.